for Graduate Studies, Professor Denise Maria Guimarães Freire, the President of FAPERJ, Professor Gerson Lima, and the coordinator of the Science and Culture Forum at the University of Rio de Janeiro, Professor Tatiana Roque. I would like to begin by giving a word of thanks to the director of the Brazilian Forum of High Studies, Professor Cecilia Castro, for this for being present at this international conference. And we want to discuss some issues that are related to the current times with the perspective of the future. And we will have panels beginning today and going through the month of June to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. We will have Brazilian and foreign speakers discussing the COVID pandemic, climate change, internet, artificial intelligence, the energy transition, all of those which are very relevant issues for the future of humanity. Actually, we can only build desirable tomorrows if we revisit the past. We must revisit the past so that the mistakes made in the past will be avoided in the future and in the present. It should be like this. The evolution of science enabled, by all means, that humanity could fulfill dreams. So science was a mechanism through which human beings were able to fulfill very ancient dreams, such as flying, being able to delve deep in deep waters and remain there for a long time. This was a dream human beings had before scientific development. Those dreams were impossible because of the biology of our species. We also dreamt of exploring oil in deep waters. Today, because of the technology that has been developed in our universities, partnering with oil and gas companies, we managed to explore deep oil in deep waters. We had so many advances. We will discuss the importance of artificial intelligence, which threatens many professions. Which will be the future professions? What are the limits of artificial intelligence? These very relevant issues will be discussed here at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and going to the entire Brazilian society. Today, science has enabled longer lives. We had many centennials. We were able to see the vaccination of many centenarians in our country. We expect human beings to reach the age of 150 years of life with quality of life. This will be possible with the help and advances of science. However, for us to advance and to reduce hunger in the world, all the perspectives of hunger with the increase of the population were changed to also because of the advancements of science in terms of food productions. But many sacrifices were faced by human beings to come here because many thinkers, most thinkers have always been attacked because of political and economic reasons. Thus, the anti-science and negationist movement is not new. It's been following the history of humanity, because behind these movements, some power interests, political interests, and economic interests are present. Once again, we see this absolutely deplorable situation throughout the world. However, these movements never hindered advancements. We will overcome mysticism, and we will end this thought that is founded exclusively upon the faith, and we will be able to advance as human beings. However, the greatest challenge we have here is the ethic limits of the scientific knowledge. So one of the desirable tomorrows is a science that is more based on ethical and bioethical criteria, so that the advancements, the scientific advancements will be better for humanity. How can we do this? Looking at the evolution of science, recognizing that it can um, create benefits, but also recognizing that it can also create tragedies, such as the nuclear bombs. So let's discuss and better the desirable tomorrows, always defending science with consciousness vehemently. These are the greatest goals of this event. Thank you once again for your presence. And let's go forward and discuss the desirable tomorrows here at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro with different thinkers who will be with us. Thank you, Professor. We now pass the floor to the coordinator of the Forum of Science and Culture at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Professor Tatiana Marins Hockey. Good morning. Welcome to all of you who are watching us. I would like to tell you that the Science and Culture Forum is represented by the Brazilian School of High Studies. And I thank Professor and Faberge for this wonderful event. And here, we at the board are very pleased to put together this event about the future. Right now, when our university has turned 100 years old, it is important to celebrate the past, but be open to the accelerated changes in this world that has been affected by the climate emergency and the pandemic that seems not to be the only one. I was reading an article by Fauci, the coordinator, Dr. Fauci, saying that we are entering the era of pandemics. So we must be prepared with science, technology, culture, innovation, and gathering all the scientific areas without the division between exact and human science, art and science. And the forum, the College of High Studies, is one of the places at university to uh, and strengthen multidisciplinarity and look at the future. So I would like to thank PR2 and Print for the partnership. Denise Freire is here representing these agencies. And this is an event that is part of the celebrations of the 100 years of the university, thinking about the future and opening to many thinkers that are internationally renowned. And in a few moments, we will also have another seminar, excuse me, about the University of Rio de Janeiro plus 100. We want to celebrate 100 more 100 years. We want to be thinking about ourselves. We will have a work group, and I would like to invite you for that. It will be an occasion for the university to think about itself, to rethink in connection with the proposals for the future at this presented at this conference about the desirable tomorrow. So have a good conference and follow us on our channels. and participate on our projects. We have a lot to think about regarding the moment, the current moment. Thank you, Professor. Now I pass the floor to the president of the foundation, Carlos Chagas Filho, FAPERJ, Professor Gerson Lima. Okay, I unmuted. Good morning. I would like to greet the rector of the university, our dear vice rector, Tatiana Hockey, the coordinator of the forum, Professor Denise Freire as well from PR2, and our dear Ana Celia, the director of this initiative, coordinating this initiative of the School for High Studies. I will speak very briefly. I am a professor at the Federal University of Rio, and I'm representing the Foundation Carlos Chagas Filho, and I consider this event extremely important. Looking at tomorrow, in my career as a scientist, but also as a manager, we are also looking towards tomorrow. So in Brazil, we need science, as mentioned before by our rector and Professor Tatiana, must be uh, must dictate the future. Scientific evidences must guide the resolution of this very sad pandemic, which has taken almost 400,000 lives in Brazil alone. So we have the social duty of acting very strongly. Our foundation, FAPERJ, since last year when the pandemic was uh, announced by the World Health Organization, we have 500 million reals invested in research, especially here in Rio, but with many partners throughout the country and international collaborations, we were able to address various aspects of this terrible disease, researching on vaccines and medications and the new mutations. So, and Ana Celia, so the choice of this title, I'm sure you participated in this choice, the desirable tomorrows. I agree with Tatiana, 100% science is not isolated in its own box. It is establishing a dialogue with society, and we've been seeing this in Brazil and throughout the world. And the advances that science produced in record time in terms of development of vaccines was astounding. We have more than 10 vaccines that have been authorized. On the other hand, we know that the pandemic is reaching society in a very unequal way, and the ones who are less protected are more affected. So it is important for the university, especially, to look at these people with a diverse gaze and propose a better tomorrow. Culture has been very affected as well by the pandemic. I would like to end. I sometimes I draft some poems, and I noticed that I had just written a poem, and I will read some of the verses about the virus and about the desirable tomorrows. We hope to change in a positive way in the way we look at the world. I will read some verses here. It is called Tomorrow Without Cholera. The unknown paralyzes us, the messenger of Mother Gaia, assaulting our physics and delving into our soul with its gigantic reach. It will resuscitate the forgotten humanity. Tomorrow will be a beautiful day, less sad than yesterday and sweeter than today. So this is what I desire. Huge success in the discussion in the with the panelists, and that I hope we may bring this message of hope for Rio de Janeiro and Brazil and the world. Thank you.
Palavra da nossa pró-reitora de pós-graduação e pesquisa da UFRJ, a professora Denise Maria Guimarães Freire. Bom dia, professora.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Antes de mais nada, eu vou saudar a todos os presentes dessa mesa de abertura. Eu gostaria de dizer que é um enorme prazer estar presente, né, aqui nessa mesa, que do lado de professores que são verdadeiros guerreiros da ciência. Eu já conheço há bastante tempo, né? Esse evento internacional ele foi organizado pelo Fórum de Ciências e Cultura, com o apoio do Centro Brasileiro de Altos Estudos, né, e teve o apoio incondicional da FAPERJ e da CAPES Print, né? E ele certamente vai nos brindar com reflexões tão relevantes para a nossa realidade de hoje e também vamos pensar no nosso amanhã. Esse evento estava planejado, né, Ana Célia, para ocorrer há 1 ano atrás, de forma presencial, mas fomos atropelados pela pandemia e todos os seus efeitos, né? A pandemia ela pegou o mundo de surpresa, né? Grandes potências globais foram assolapadas por esse inimigo invisível e sem fronteiras, que é o vírus, né? As potentes armas projetadas para outros fins não foram capazes de evitar colapso na saúde, na economia, na sociedade e na nossa vida. E nós certamente não podemos fechar os olhos para o salve-se quem puder, o hiato ainda maior que foi aberto entre essas separações entre nações ricas e pobres. Por exemplo, na busca pelo desenvolvimento e a apropriação das vacinas. Nessa fila tem sempre o primeiro e o último. A pandemia não foi o amanhã que desejamos, mas o hoje, que nos traz lições de como nos preparar melhor para o futuro, que é cheio de incertezas, mas está repleto de muitas possibilidades. As projeções científicas elas nos permitem avaliar os cenários possíveis e prováveis, e também nos ajudar a pensar em elementos que possam minimizar todas as mazelas. O aquecimento global, por exemplo, é uma realidade, mas a forma como lidamos e planejamos o nosso futuro frente a essa ameaça certamente modificará ou acelerará as tendências. A ciência ela tem um papel fundamental nesse processo, porque conhecer o passado, pensar no presente e projetar o futuro são recursos que permitirão nosso melhor desenvolvimento como seres humanos. Em tempos de negacionismos científicos, o posicionamento da comunidade científica deve ser ainda muito mais contundente. Precisamos de tempos de luz e não de trevas, de conhecimento embasado, discutido, confrontado, e não de verdades pré-estabelecidas, ditadas e que provocam a cegueira na nossa alma. Que amanhã desejamos, que amanhã construiremos, como nos prepararemos para o amanhã, como nossas atitudes de hoje afetarão o amanhã. Bom, não há para essas perguntas respostas certas, verdadeiras ou falsas. Porém, não há nenhuma área do conhecimento que esteja fora da lógica desse pensar. Refletir sobre o passado, o presente e o futuro é o nosso papel, é o nosso dever profissional e social. Não se trata de reflexões restritas a territórios. Pensar no amanhã é pensar na humanidade, é transgredir fronteiras, é disseminar o conhecimento. A UFRJ ela tem como missão essa missão, porque ela não deve ter muros. Queremos e devemos estar cada vez mais integrados à sociedade. É preciso que mostremos tudo o que se faz nessa instituição. É preciso que se divulgue a ciência. O entendimento sobre a importância da ciência pela sociedade também passa por estreitamento destes laços. A universidade ela não deve falar por si mesma. Ela deve transgredir, demonstrar como estar presente, com conhecimento materializado nas mais diversas coisas do nosso cotidiano. A ciência que aqui se produz na UFRJ está no dia a dia das pessoas, dos brasileiros e de tantos outros cidadãos do mundo. Nossa universidade está crescentemente presente no mundo todo. Estamos entre os mais internacionalizados do país, mas ainda precisamos muito acelerar esse processo. O conhecimento não tem fronteira, não deve ficar circunscrito em território nacional. A ciência é e deve ser, por essência, internacional. A Pró-Reitoria de Pesquisa e Pós-Graduação, por meio da internacionalização da CAPES, o Programa de Internacionalização da CAPES, o CAPES-Print, tem buscado fomentar esse movimento internacional de pesquisadores, de modo que as trocas sejam cada vez mais frequentes e que, juntos, possamos levar o Brasil para um patamar de desenvolvimento que, naturalmente, envolve muito mais investimentos em educação, em pesquisa e em inovação. Até o momento, apenas no âmbito do print, a UFRJ pôde realizar internacionalização com 285 instituições estrangeiras, localizadas em 31 diferentes países, visando a construção ou até a consolidação de parcerias já existentes em uma ampla rede de cooperação acadêmica no exterior. Ao longo desses 5 anos do projeto, que serão...
studies, and along these 5 years, we planned 1,043 scholarships, 73% for the abroad and 44 inside the country. We will have 470 short travels that will be done by the students, despite the pandemic, the fact that the pandemic had a great impact on the program, causing postponing and of many actions. We, teachers, professors, and students organized themselves, bringing a lot of interesting perspectives that will be shown in the print panels. Along this week, we can know a little bit of the researchers that have been developed in the international programs of this university. These debates will bring lessons and questionings about what to expect and how to deal with our moment. I hope that our tomorrow is much, much better than today, and that we all have an excellent event. Thank you very much. I thank you, and I will say to Professor Gerson that I loved his poem. Thank you, Professor. Now, the Vice Rector of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Professor Carlos Frederico Leão da Rocha. Good morning to all of you. Good morning, Tatiana. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for the organization of this event. It's fundamental to look at this. The university has a very important role on this, because with science, culture, and art that are developed here, we can plan better futures. This week, we saw something that made us very scared, the planning of the future of our Minister of Economy. He is planning a future where people have to die earlier, which is exactly the opposite of what we wish. It's the opposite of what we would like. And I was recalling, and here I have a reference to art, recalling a film that was very important at the beginning of the 80s, the Narayama Ballad. The film happens in a Japanese village from the 19th century. And in this village, you have rules for the survival in a subsistence economy, and families cannot have more children. So after the third child, they are disappropriated. So what was more scary is that the elderly, when they lost their teeth, they should be taken to the Narayama mountain and left there to die. The future planned by our Minister of Economy is this, is to let the old people in the mountain to die. From that moment on, I learned that health and where people can be taken to the mountain, cannot be taken to the mountains, where we can build a filter in the earth to keep the climate conditions normal. And if we don't want this future, what are the future trajectories we want to look for? What are the knowledges we would like to produce? And that's why I think it's so important to have this conference. And I congratulate the organization of this event, because it will tell us where we want to get, what we want to reach in the university. This for the academic system is fundamental, because we have to look through science and through a perspective of what we wish. This involves ethics, community, and in certain moments, I believe that in this country, it's exactly what's lacking, the idea of humanity. So here, I'm going to conclude saying that this university, UFRJ, is going through a very difficult moment, and according to the futures planned by us, we will have to have budgetary choices that are very difficult. Our budget today is 50% of the budget of 2015 and 20% of the budget of 2012. So we are going towards a future that will have no health, no security for the future, and we don't want this. We want to plan something different for this country, because we need a better future. So I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and for the themes developed. So now I'll give the floor back to our Professor Patricia Veiga, so that Ana Célia can moderate the next panel. And here we can conclude this panel. Exactly at 11 o'clock, we close this panel, and we thank the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, the Forum of Science and Culture, the Pro-Rector of Post-Graduation and Research, the Carlos Chagas Filho Foundation of Rio de Janeiro, and the Coordination to Improve Higher Education Personnel. And we thank all the authorities present and all of you who followed us. And now we invite our hostess, the director of the Brazilian High Studies College, Ana Célia Castro, to continue with the event. Have a wonderful day. Good morning, Professor Ana Célia Castro. Sejam todos bem-vindos. Seria típico, mas eu não vou começar a falar sobre os tópicos da... Toda essa informação está disponível.
Talk about the meaning of desirable tomorrows. Tomorrows will be most desirable than ever in the post-pandemic world, in Brazil, in India, everywhere. Desirable tomorrows is not a utopia. A utopia is an imagined place or state of things in which everything is perfect, an ideal and thus elusive place. Utopia is a Greek word meaning nowhere. Thomas More used that word as the title of his book published in 1516, in which he described an ideal society. Desirable tomorrows is not a utopia. While utopia is nowhere, desires do have a place. They have many, because they are moving forward all the time. Wishes are not immutable, and furthermore, they have multiple destinies. Desires different from utopia can be achieved. They are part of the dreams of humanity, though the visions reflect sometimes daily reality. Desires are what we want now and what is necessary to build a better future. The understanding synthesized at this conference will be essential to building the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro Institute of the Future. After completing 100 years, our university is looking forward to the horizons of the future. The SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has shone a bright light on the various crises we are facing: the health crisis, the long-term climate crisis, economic vulnerability, employment become more precarious with impacts on income, the surprising deficiencies of state capacities, institutional fractures, and the radicalization of political views. We have no choice but to reflect on the future. It is therefore essential to think about public policies in the context with which this conference is concerned: the Sustainable Development Goals, artificial intelligence, the frontiers of medicine and biology, and the energy transition. Looking to the future can have a decisive effect on the present. Doing so forms the starting point of transformation. The possible is what we do have today. The strategic question is how to think about tomorrow, the desirable tomorrow, starting from what we have today, yet without accepting that we cannot change the present. While we wish a long life for Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, its future, indeed, the future is now. Thank you very much. And then I pass the floor to Leonardo Bulamaki, who will be coordinating this session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ana Célia. And dear guests, colleagues, and friends, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome. Well, let me start my brief introductory remarks with a question posed to me more than once when we were organizing this conference. Why start a desirable tomorrow's month-long event with COVID, the most undesirable event pressing us all now? And furthermore, the pandemic was and is also a catalyst for many problems and crises that are already in place or were already in place before it broke out. As such, COVID is a gargantuan reality check as well as an accelerator of history. And for the sake of illustration of what I mean about that, just here are a few examples, and I'm going to add a bit to what Ana Célia just mentioned. We have the health crisis, which was the tip of an iceberg that exposed a deeply broken social contract in most parts of the world. It displayed worsening patterns of income inequality and increased them. It revealed the weakness of state capacities, and especially in the West, although right now India is clearly an outlier in that regard. Probably Jayadi will talk some about that. It plunged whole sectors of the economy into a deep contraction, and many are still facing the risk of bankruptcy and even extinction. Old and new sources of financial fragility are surfacing. A deep political polarization and a crisis of political leadership are in place. A geopolitical divide is widening, with the US and Western Europe somewhat not very comfortably on the US side, and China and Russia aided by Iran on the other. And furthermore, we have now an appended relationship among work, place, income, risks, rewards. This is everywhere. And we have also the emergence of a key social strata, essential workers. And a key question, are they adequately rewarded? And the answer is clearly in a negative. So these are just some of the main concerns of our troubled times, but they hardly exhaust the list. But fortunately, we have a superb team of panelists, actually much more than that. We have thinkers, acute analysts to address those concerns today. Jayari Goss, Jan Kregel, and Yochai Benkler are first-class minds who happen to be at the cutting edge of research as well as active participants in the debates surrounding these issues. I won't spend time introducing them because the conference website does that. And in case you're still hungry for information, just Google their names. You will access or have access to plenty of material. And of course, they won't provide the solutions for our problems in this section. That's for sure. But their take will guide us to better understand them and maybe throw some light into how to get to desirable tomorrows, the big theme of our conference. As I wrote in one of the technical notes for the conference, most of the problems we face now are really not new, but most of the answers to them have to be. And our panelists are strong candidates to advance some new answers. And they will speak for 15 minutes each and subsequently react to each other in a 5-minute fire chat. That should throw some debate already in the panel. After that, questions from the audience will be taken and we will close the session with the answers. So thank you all for being with us. Special thanks for our panelist guests. And let's get to it. And so, Chayari, the virtual floor is yours. Thanks much for coming.
Thank you so much, Leonardo, and thank you, Ana Celia, for this opportunity and this chance to interact even virtually with all of you and Jan and Yochai. It is, well, for many of us, it's a terrible time. And it's a very weird feeling, I have to tell you, to be an Indian living right now in the US, because you really see this business of the K-shaped thing happening in your own life. I have friends and colleagues back in India who actually have died because they could not get oxygen. Every day, every hour, there is news of a new tragedy. What is happening in India is beyond words, it's unbelievable. And yet here in the US, I see that things are opening up. People are going back to normal life and planning their next vacations. And it's a completely different world. And I think that kind of epitomizes what is going on in the world today, which is a peculiar sense in which these inequalities are not just exacerbated. I think you already mentioned that it has already been highlighted by COVID, but they are actually now being cemented in a way that is extremely worrying for any possibility of desirable tomorrows. So I'm going to just highlight a couple of these. But I also want to emphasize that what's happening in India is also fundamentally, I won't even say it's a failure of governance. It is a crime against humanity. The writer Arundhati Roy has recently written in The Guardian, I think she's captured it very well. This is a man-made catastrophe because it reflects the arrogance and the cruelty of a leadership that has simply not bothered about the implications for people, has encouraged super spreader events, massive election rallies with hundreds of thousands of people addressed by the Prime Minister, celebrating the crowds who are all there gathered together in the absence of masks, encouraging this kind of unnecessary gatherings, bringing forward a massive Hindu festival that is held every 12 years, bringing it forward by a full year on astrological advice. A big festival held on the banks of the Ganges over the past 3 weeks, in which 4 million people gathered. So we haven't even seen the full impacts of all of what is going on right now. The worst is yet to come, I'm afraid. And I'm saying this as someone who has already lost many people dear to me, and who has colleagues who are actually fighting for their lives in sometimes at home, sometimes in situations where they're unable to get basic medical care. This is, of course, something, as I said, that reflects complete disastrous governance in India. But there is a global aspect to this, which is that most of this is avoidable and can still be avoided. Globally, we are not able to vaccinate the world's population because of an artificial shortage. This is a shortage created by the intellectual property rights held by certain vaccine producers, the ones that have got the approved vaccines, which they are refusing to share with other other companies that could make the vaccine. The WHO has estimated that you could actually vaccinate 60% of the population of the whole world with the available production capacity, if only this technology were to be shared. The developing countries have been asking in the TRIPS Council to suspend intellectual property for all COVID-related vaccines and treatments. They have been asking this since October last year. It has been rejected 9 times in the TRIPS Council by a group led by all the advanced country governments. And this is ridiculous because it's against the interests even of people in the advanced countries. It's not just a question of grabbing vaccines and trying to vaccinate your own population. The longer you allow this to persist, the more you get these mutant varieties. And we know that it's the virus mutations in India that have created this problem. They are proving resilient to several of the existing vaccines. And so this can come back and affect people in the developed world as well. It is ridiculous to restrict production in this way. And so I think one of the first things we need for a desirable tomorrow is to stop the damage today. And an essential part of that would be the suspension of intellectual property rights on vaccines and all other COVID-related treatments for the duration of the pandemic. The other huge aspect of this K-shaped, I can't even call it recovery for one group and dramatic decline for a large part of the rest of the world, is the huge difference in fiscal stimuli across advanced countries and developing countries. Of course, the US leads the pack. I think it's accounted for more than half of the total amount of stimulus spending according to the IMF. But the developed countries anyway account for 80% of the stimulus spending. And if you want to go by per capita comparisons, I'm not sure what the latest number is in the US because they keep adding to the spending. Jan will have a better idea, but it's certainly in the range of $20,000 plus per capita. By contrast, the available data suggests that for the least developed countries, the stimulus in the last year in 2020 was $2 per capita. $2 per capita. In the emerging markets and developing countries as a group, it was $5 per capita. Countries like Mexico and India, we are outliers. We hardly spent anything more. In Mexico, at least they transferred some more spending on social protection. In India, we didn't even do that. So we have a population that has been enfeebled, impoverished, facing massively declining nutrition levels, loss of livelihood, now facing this massive second wave, a tsunami of COVID infections. This inequality in fiscal response is very much a result of the nature of the global architecture, which Jan and you and all of you know much better than me. But really, it's very, very difficult for many developing countries to try and expand their spending. They immediately face capital flight. They face downgrades by the international credit rating agencies. Many of them are already suffering very large burdens of sovereign debt or will need to actually guarantee the existing private debts in ways that are causing their interest burden to be larger than their health spending and social protection spending. All of these are things that necessarily require international cooperation. And yet we're not seeing enough of that. The IMF spring meetings have been underwhelming in terms of any real proposals. The SDR issue is certainly welcome. It's not enough, but again, the plans are for it to start sometime in June or July. And every day means actually more lives lost in the way that things are proceeding. So the global aspect, despite all the statements that we're all in this together and no one is safe till everyone is safe, everyone says all that, but they clearly don't mean it. Because if you look at the way that the leadership of the rich countries is behaving, they don't actually think that the rest of the world matters very much. But it does, and it will come back, as I said, to affect everybody. So I think the most critical thing we need to do, we cannot address any of the other challenges, the health crisis, the climate crisis, the global economic crisis. We can't address these without addressing these fundamental inequalities, of which I think I mentioned only two, but there are several others. One final point I just would like to highlight is that another major difference across developed and developing countries is that in the developing world, about 70% of our workers on average are informal. Whereas in the developed world, it's exactly the opposite. It's about 20% of the workers are informal. And that really means that in these periods of dramatic downswing, for whatever reason, whether they are illness induced or lockdown reduced or what induced, there is a larger number of our workers in the developing countries who do not have any kind of legal or social protection and are forced to fend for themselves. And so it's not just that the overall fiscal stance has been much better in the developed countries, but also that the social protection has been much better. Whereas in the developing world, the dominant part of the workforce simply has not been able to access adequate social protection. I think Brazil is an outlier in the developing world in terms of what you have managed to provide your people over the period of the pandemic. But in most of the rest of the developing world, people have really been left to fend for themselves in ways that are really hard when they're already at a margin of subsistence. So these are depressing, but as I said, none of this is necessary. All of this can be changed. And so when we are talking about desirable tomorrows, we have to immediately, I think Ana Celia said that the future starts now. We have to think immediately of the steps that can be taken that would set the stage for medium-term trajectories that are both more sustainable and more just. Let me stop here because I'm really anxious to hear what Jan has to say.
Thank you so much, Jayari. This was a quick but very enlightening presentation. So let me get the floor to Jan Kregel. Jan, good morning. Thanks for coming, and the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, Leonardo and Ophelia. Grazie. Okay. It's very interesting that after the pandemic hit, I increasingly get asked to talk about things that I don't know anything about. And I suppose this is, in a sense, a good thing because it makes you think about things you wouldn't have normally have done, but also this comes with a caveat in that most of the things that I'm going to talk about are sort of superficial understandings of things that I've picked up, as I would say, more or less outside of the basic discipline, which I'm supposed to be some sort of an expert. So I'm going to start out with, I'm going to try and do a screen share here, if I can. Okay, I cannot do that, so we won't do that. Leonardo, do you have the possibility of getting the screen share? Or?
I'm trying to do that. Yesterday we were, but
Jan, you should have the share screen green icon at the bottom.
No, I'm pressing, but I get the message that the host disabled that.
Yeah.
Which
can we request him to enable it? I think Jan has to be made a co-host. If Jan is made a co-host, then he can share the screen.
Well, no, okay. The host can always fix this if they want to. Well, I'll just start out and we'll see if we get this fixed.
Maybe now you can. I don't know. Can you try?
Let me see. Okay. We now go here. The question is whether you're going to get the right Okay, Zoom phone. Oh my God, what is that?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
We're good.
yeah, I think we made it. Okay, that's good. Okay, I was going to start out. No, we have to go back here to do this.
Yeah, here the
Somehow the controls on this. All right, we'll do.
Great.
Okay, there we go. Finally.
Great.
Okay. Now, what I'm going to start out by doing is saying, as I said, these are things I know nothing about. So I always revert to something I do know something about. And as a good post-Keynesian, I revert to expectations. So that most of the analysis that I've done of the response to the pandemic has been in terms of expectations. And sort of the first thing I did was to go back and say, what did Roosevelt in fact do? Well, Roosevelt was not a Keynesian. He didn't know about deficit spending. He didn't know anything about economics. But he did know something about expectation. And very quickly, he managed to produce a change in expectations about the future of the US economy. And most of his success was, in fact, supported by the fact that he convinced people that things were going to be better in the future. So the problem that we've really got in terms of desirable tomorrows is trying to convince people that there is a more desirable tomorrow, that there is something that we currently do have. Because I think most of the problems that we have are precisely because of the way people have responded, and the presumption that the only way that a more desirable tomorrow can take place is by looking after themselves. That is, by adopting a very individualistic or a very selfish solution. Jayati has already mentioned that the pharmaceutical companies are not willing to share their technology. The US government is not willing to share this massive amount of stored vaccines that we have available and nobody wants. So this is the sort of the leitmotif that I'm going to try to work on relative to the analysis of a desirable future that Keynes gave us in the economic possibilities of our grandchildren. Okay. Now, the first point that I'm going to make is that the future is always undesirable. Basically, as biological individuals, we are set up in such a way that our cognition of current conditions is always predicated on the past. Okay, the neurobiologists tell us that in fact our brains are pre-programmed in order to respond to external stimuli in terms of responses that have been built up through the evolutionary process. We don't even have to think about them. Okay, so this means what? It means that number one, we're always referring backwards, and referring backwards means that the past is always going to, in some sense, be preferable to the future. The kind of responses that we see to economic change, if you look at conservative governments, they're always saying, well, the past was much better than it used to be. It was much better when we had miners in the mine. We killed a whole lot of miners. The miners lived terribly, but we have a very strong political support in the US right now for restoring the coal mine so that people can go back and die in the coal mines. Why is this? It's irrational. Well, it's rational because we always believe, and we're sort of programmed to believe, that the past is better than what we have. So that the desirable futures start with a sort of a cognitive deficit. Okay, we sort of downgrade them to start with. The second part is that we're programmed for survival. All of these inbuilt automatic responses are survival responses. And our futures are always built on survival responses. And this is where this idea of building confidence or building certainty, or Keynes would call it persuasion of a better future, comes in. Because we have to convince people somehow or other that the future will in fact be better, that it's not simple individual survival that is the most important aspect of dealing with current conditions, because in fact that is what normally gives us the future. So if we go to Keynes, Keynes, as I said, was the only person who in fact tried to produce some idea of a desirable future. Now, what did he do? Well, he wrote this famous essay, and the famous essay said that the desirable future was, well, it's not device subsistence, it's basic subsistence. Sorry about that. He limited himself. It was basic subsistence that he was talking about in the desirable future. He said, we're perfectly capable of doing this. Obviously, I point out quickly that he didn't have Veblen in mind, he didn't have Hirsch in mind, he didn't have Duesenberry in mind, all of these people who said that basic subsistence was really not going to be sufficient for a desirable future. But he said, we can do it. And in fact, we look at the date at which he was writing, the 1930s, more or less the global economies have in fact produced the level of income that he thought would be sufficient to provide for basic subsistence for everybody. Now, obviously, this didn't happen. It didn't happen because, well, first of all, the problem of income inequality, but basically, a whole number of other issues have become part of basic subsistence. Pandemic subsistence. Okay, the first thing in terms of the pandemic, we said, well, let's give these people money and then let's tell them they all have to stay home. That to me was pretty stupid. Why? Because if you're staying home, you've got money, you can't spend it. You can't go out, you can't go to the shops. If the shops can't sell it, they don't produce it. And basically, you've made the problem worse. Basic needs was providing food, it was providing shelter, it was providing certainty to people. But we didn't do that right away. Secondly, sustainable environment, longer term. Okay, do we have clean water, clean air, climate crisis? Are these basic subsistence? Okay, these are all things that more or less it was impossible for Keynes to predict when he was looking. And the idea that somehow or other individuals would be capable of doing this depended on what? Well, depended on something that was very important. And this was Keynes' idea of looking at the idea, the basic idea of what now we would call the fallacy of composition. Okay, the basic idea that most of these other aspects that we put into the pot of basic subsistence are now things that are systemic. They're not individual. That is, it's very difficult for the individual to identify his contribution to these basic results. Sustainable environment. Well, I really don't pollute that much, so I really can't be the cause of the decline in the environment. So we're back again to this individual response, the survival response, which is preventing us from getting to the provision of this sort of wider set of basic subsistence elements. And it's really not a question now, Keynes' assumption. We have sufficient resources. Yes, we can do it. We can create the capital equipment. Yes, we can. Okay, so basically the difficulty is convincing people that their personal survival behavior has to be supported in such a way that it provides these basic elements of subsistence, which is impossible for individuals to evaluate and for individuals to assess. Their internal survival mechanisms simply do not take into account the degradation of the environment until it's too late, until it gets so bad that people die. And this is partially what's happening with the pandemic. Just as an aside, I remember when I was teaching in Holland, I'd take groups of students to Germany. We had a joint seminar with a German university, and we were at that time in Holland, this was a zero growth period. And we were talking about these difficulties, and one German sociologist stood up and said, look, now people are biological animals, dinosaurs died. If people don't get this, people are going to die. Why should we be worried about it? This is a biological solution. Well, Keynes thought that there was a different solution. Now, his response was what? Well, his response was that the problem was all caused by technological unemployment. And the technological unemployment was basically caused by the fact that people had inappropriate moral principles. That is, that they loved money more than they loved the provision of these basic principles. The moral problem of our age is concerned with the love of money, with habitual and money motive in 9/10 of the activities of life. Well, what Keynes said is that if we get people to stop worrying about loving money and to learn something else, then we can get to our desirable future. Well, the love of money, is that our problem? Well, I won't go through the love of money being always bad, but we're looking here at something which we can translate, not directly into the love of money, but the love of money is what? Well, money is the thing which does provide individuals with a defense against uncertainty. That was Keynes' basic argument. So that if individuals are continuing to defend their monetary principles, this is going to this is going to prevent the kinds of aggregate results, the political results that we need in order to provide this expanded set of basic needs. How do we see this? Well, again, we see this in the fact that on the one hand, people don't vaccinate, they don't take the vaccine. Why? Because it goes against their individual liberty, their individual response. I can do it better. Okay? This bifurcation that we've had in terms of the one side which says, oh, we should all go into lockdown, and the other side says we can't. This is a love of money problem. Okay? The people who don't want to go into lockdown say that I have to go to work because if I don't work, I'm not going to survive. So I'm willing to go to work. I'm willing to undertake my independent survival, independently of the fact that I may end up killing the other half of the population. And this is the basic political problem that we currently have. And this is the sort of basic political bifurcation that exists in virtually all countries who are facing the pandemic. So Jayati talks about the conditions in India. Well, the conditions in India are, on the one hand, a certain group of people are willing to sacrifice their own, what they believe to be their own individual best interest for the interest of the community, and the other half are not. And in the end, if we can't resolve this problem, and I'm trying to say now, it's not only simply the love of money here, which is important. We have this idea of the love of liberty and the love of all of these things. But basically, these are independent, personal decisions to act on the basis of individual interest. And that individual interest goes in terms, as I think Keynes would say, sort of the love of money. So the problem that we've got in terms of I talk about here the political problem. Keynes put down three of them. Economic efficiency, well, more or less, we're pretty good at that. Social justice, we're awful at that. Individual liberty, well, unfortunately, we're much too good at providing individual liberty, because those individual liberties are precisely the love of money that Keynes was talking about. And when he said that we need to convince people that there are other things in life than accumulating money, like the poem that we heard earlier, people have to learn to appreciate poetry more than appreciating their bank account, or to appreciate poetry more than appreciating the shareholder value of the pharmaceutical companies, then we're never going to get to what I'm talking about, Keynes' missing number 4, environmental sustainability, social justice, or individual liberty. And the question is, in what way can the government provide that social justice, that stability, that would allow individuals to take decisions which may not respond to their knee-jerk individual survival instinct, but in fact provide the survival of the community. And having said that, I think I will stop my share, and hopefully I've not gone too far out of the range of discussion. I know Leonardo wanted me to talk about current policies, but desirable futures and current policies really don't fit that much together. What we have to, I think, understand is why we don't get the kinds of desirable policies that produce the response that we would like. And again, we'll come back to Jayati's argument about the pharmaceutical patents. I mean, this is a very clear example of individual interests dominating, or the money interest dominating over the community interest, and the difficulty in resolving those problems. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, John. Brilliant as always. And so, Yochai, please, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
Thank you, Leonardo. It's good to be with you, with the other panelists. I have to warn you that I'm going to have a completely different talk than what you thought I would, largely in response to what the prior two speakers and you yourself raised. But I'm happy to come to questions of propaganda and social networks in the conversation later if we want. But really, as I was listening this morning, I think there's a very different frame that's worth thinking about. And in some sense, you could imagine it almost as the polar opposite explanatory framework to what Jan presented as an individual, biological, natural way of thinking about the world. And I want instead to talk about history and to locate the present crisis in a century of crises and the resulting regimes that emerged out of them. At the end of the long 19th century, we have a 30-year crisis. World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II play out as the ideal of the individual in classical liberalism gets displaced by the discovery of the social from Durkheim to Weber. And in the context of this great conflagration that included also the pandemic, the flu pandemic, but was bookended by the two world wars with the Great Depression in the middle. Across the world, we discovered the social and saw the emergence of solidarity as a core organizing principle and a version of high modernism, of state planning, of managerial planning. And we saw an integration of technologies that were focused on harnessing and controlling the masses, the assembly line, electrification, flight, radio, television, the mass media, combined with a way of looking at the world that emphasized expertise, standardization, national economies with strong national identity and solidarity, with emphasis on the family wage, the family man, a very clear patriarchal structure that is seen as a reflection of the state, and institutions, whether it was Keynesianism or dirigisme, whether it was national-led development policies with Taylorist structures and Fordist structures of production and unions, national and regulated industries, after the version that was fascism was defeated. This competition between the authoritarian version of social solidarity and control and the democratic version set up the Cold War. This only survived for 30 years before we went into another 15 to 25, depending on what you want to count, year of crisis. And if I focus on the US, which is what I know about, it's really Vietnam and the great inflation. We see a crisis of confidence in the social, a crisis of confidence in expertise and managerialism, and a re-emergence, a reinvention in neoliberalism of the individual as the core area of concern, with its left spin, not only the Milton Friedman version of the individual profit maximizer, but also with the left spin of self-actualization and self-realization and focusing on the me and on the choice in everything. And what we saw from the 80s was a dramatic new regime that shattered solidarity and emphasized the individual, whether it was individual consumption, whether it was consumer sovereignty instead of citizen sovereignty, whether it was shareholder value over stakeholder managerialism. And again, we saw on one hand a completely new cluster of technologies, starting with the shipping container and the barcode and moving to the personal computer and the spreadsheet, a complete transformation of the core ideas to free choice in market, replacing economic security, pluralism and cosmopolitanism, replacing family and social solidarity structures as the core drivers, a sense of winner-take-all markets and a rising tide that will raise all boats and trickle down, obviously, with the most extreme version being Reagan and Thatcher, but varieties of liberalization then working out throughout the rest of the world. And institutionally, we saw a strong emphasis on deregulation, on privatization, internationalization and globalization as replacements. And that was, again, for about 30 years, the governing structure until the present crisis. And I think the present crisis, at the moment at least, is combining primarily the Great Recession and the pandemic as these major shocks to the system, about 10, 12 years apart from each other. And the question is what comes in its stead. It can't be a doubling down on the individual in the same way. It's going to have to be some alternative solution. What we're seeing is that one version of the reemergence of the social as a response to crisis is atavistic, identity-based ethno-nationalism and authoritarianism. And in some countries with stronger democratic traditions, we see majoritarian authoritarianism. That is to say, leaders emerging like Donald Trump who harness identity-based hatred and ethno-nationalist rejection of the other, both the other at home in the case of racism and the other abroad in terms of nationalism, to gain a genuine majority and then govern as a charismatic authoritarian figure aiming towards suppressing democracy. And we see this phenomenon happening across several democracies in the world, and in countries with less longer-term historical commitment, we're seeing that reemergence. That's more directly authoritarian, as obviously the most obviously in the case of Russia. The problem is that we don't have a coherent, well-defined, solidaristic pluralism program. We don't have a similarly parallel re-emergence of a clear version of the social on the progressive or democratic side or anti-authoritarian or pluralistic side. We don't have a real basis or historically for knowing whether solidarism and pluralism can live together comfortably. But what we're seeing is essentially we can, by implication from the failures of neoliberalism and the dramatic increase in economic insecurity around the world as a result of the extraction of a very large share of total productivity growth by a very small portion of the world and national population, we know what we need to invert. And primarily what we need to invert is containing the market, both by harnessing the state, but again, we can't have a naive revival of the role of the state as it was between World War II and the Great Inflation, and revitalizing the social in a way that is more pluralistic. So critically, what we're seeing as emerging elements, and I'm going to end with this, are programs to reduce market imperative. You think of it as freedom from want or partial decommodification of basic needs. Even in the United States, with all of its, and Jayati talked about this as the US spending fiscally much more than others, and obviously there's a genuine question of how global inequality works into this. But the levels of investments, and in particular the foci of investment, of what Biden is doing now is well to the left of anything that happened in the US since the 60s, in the sense of trying to make sure that there's a basic revenue stream for families with children, basic commitments to something like full employment as a public provision, basic commitment to deploying that towards a particular technological path of sustainability. That's the idea of the Green New Deal. There's a very strong emphasis on restructuring power in the economy, understanding the economy as not primarily or solely being about efficiency, but continuously being a struggle across classes understood in terms of location and economic relations, and a revitalization of the necessity of building institutions that strengthen workers in relation to capital rather than imagining that everything will trickle down in an efficient market. We're beginning to see efforts to socially embed production, revival of conceptions of cooperativism, efforts to change managerial culture towards stakeholderism and purpose-driven organizations. We don't know which of these will play out and succeed, but we are seeing battles over the ideology of what appropriate market behavior is, away from fully independent markets a la Friedman, and back into a revival of socially embedded production. We're seeing again the effort to rebuild state capacity, and I think in this regard, the central role of states in battling the pandemic needs to be leveraged, and the central failure of states that fail to do so needs to be built on to reconstruct our understanding of the central role of well-functioning and accountable states to operate. And finally, we need a sustained understanding of the fallibility of the state and to build genuine democratic accountability into all of these systems. So a great limitation on imagining the desirable tomorrow is the absence of such a coherent package as we saw emerging after World War II, as we saw to the detriment of many emerging after the Great Inflation and the crisis of the late 60s and the 70s. And that essentially, to me, is the primary intellectual role of a project like yours, thinking about desirable tomorrow, is to put together the elements that could provide for a solidaristic pluralism of a new form that is committed both to socially sustainable and ecologically sustainable continuous increase in standard of living, and primarily and first and foremost, generalizing economic security across the population as a whole. And I think I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
So, Yochai, thank you. Extremely acute, again, as always. So I told you, colleagues on the audience, that we have three first-class minds, thinkers here. So, and I think also that we have material for a discussion from what the three of you just said. So, before asking you to react, and I will ask Jayati first because we'll go in the same order to react to what we just heard. Let me throw one for the three of you in terms of, for the sake of provocation. I'm under the impression that we heard three different stories about mostly the West, with India as an outlier, because India is not a Western country, but the way it's behaving, it looks very much like the Western countries, what we did. But we have Asia, and we have especially East Asia. And I would ask, do we have East-West divide in the sense that the story that you just told and the reflections you just made are very well fitted to the West and with India in, but not very much to the East, because there we have a very different combination of state capacity, political leadership, and culture. The three elements, the mix of these three very important elements it's different. And my question obviously is, well, to what extent you agree with that? And if so, is the problem basically a Western problem, or all that you said also fits that well with East Asia? So please react the way you want, but that's the one I wanted to hear something about. Jayadi, please, the floor is yours again.
Okay, well, thank you, Leonardo, for that curveball. Apropos East Asia, we have to be careful not to homogenize it. China, Vietnam, Korea, yes, definitely different, especially China, Vietnam among developing countries, because South Korea is no longer developing. Definitely different. But the rest, I mean, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, no, I'm sorry, it's also equally, not equally, nowhere is as bad as India right now. But if you like, the sort of neoliberal mindset is also deeply entrenched. They have also run down their health systems. They are also likely to face future. So I don't think it's a Asia versus, I don't think it's a hemispheric issue. I think it's really a question of how deeply the neoliberal ideologies have permeated into the state rather than, and the society actually. But having said that, okay, one thing I want to take issue with you, Yochai, I mean, this last 30 years has not been efficient, right? This is not about efficient market working. This is about power of large capital to get the state to promote its interests. And let's face it, this is a system on life support. I mean, even in the US, capitalism would not survive without huge infusions of liquidity. And we've seen this from the 80s onwards, right? I mean, Jan knows this better than anybody, beginning with savings and loan scandal, but then the 90s and the Enron thing, and then, of course, the global financial crisis. But since then, this is a system that has only survived because of continuous blood transfusions, right? I mean, of liquidity, and now even that's not enough. So fiscal support, it's not efficient. So then the question is, how come this is happening? It's because of power. And this I want to ask Jan, because, you know, isn't it all, it's not just that there's one group that wants something and another group that doesn't. It's a question of which one has got power, political power. What's the power imbalance? And I think, I mean, here in the US, you dodged a bullet, or maybe you dodged, I don't know, now that we see what's happening in India, a firing squad. But you know, it's really a question of political power. I don't think what is happening in India is inevitable, even given the previous history of neoliberalism. I think it's really a reflection of the nature of the power balances that exist in India at the moment, and the kinds of, you know, groups in power and their interests. So what we're getting in India is disaster capitalism at its worst. It need not have been at its worst. You could have got different varieties of, you know, response to it, even within a background of neoliberal, you know, hegemony over the past 2 decades. So I suppose the question to Jan would be that it's not just that people in general are uncertain and have certain risk preferences about the future and so on. It's also a question of who has the power, what their preferences are, and who is then able to change the entire policy discussion in their favor. Which is why I would say, and then I'm coming back to Yochai, I don't think it's an absence of us not having an alternative in a model. You know, they keep saying that, oh, you don't have a well-developed alternative. That's not true. I think I mean, people in this room have been putting forward, this Zoom room have been putting forward alternatives, viable alternatives, and changing them according to how the situation changes, nationally, locally, globally. It's really a question of whether those alternatives are able to capture popular imagination. And that, I think, has a lot to do with the role of the media, a lot to do with being able to show how this can work in particular situations and circumstances, and the way that, talk about asymmetric information. Most people are not even aware of the implications of certain regulatory practices or certain other things that completely transform their lives, and therefore they do not, protest against them. So I don't think it's the fact that we don't have a perfect, cohesive model. I mean, let's face it, even Keynes and the Bretton Woods thing, it was all work in progress that kept getting built on in a way. I think it's really the inability to impact the public imagination. And that's really where we need to put a lot more attention. Like, maybe that's my feeling anyway.
Okay, so Jan?
Okay, again, I will venture into many areas in which I have no expertise at all. So this is simply the random statements coming off here. The first thing, obviously, China, according to what I publicly have written, had the best response. And obviously they had the best response. Why? Well, we can say it was because of their cultural and social traditions, in which people are willing to sacrifice themselves for the community, for the family, or whatever, or it was because of the efficiency of the Chinese Communist Party. There's some dispute about how efficient that response in fact was, but basically the Chinese response was to look, as I say, to providing support and, for my analysis, certainty to individuals who were subject to lockdown. You went through Wuhan. While Wuhan had their lockdown for 2.5 months, people banded together along with local governments in order to provide subsistence. They provided subsistence, and when the lockdown was over, more or less everything went back to what was reasonably normal. Now, from the West, we look at this and we talk about, well, this was a drastic suspension of civil rights, drastic suspension of liberty. We're going to fight against this sort of social cohesion and organization. I just look at this and, I just shake my head and say, people simply do not understand what they're talking about. If you're going to have some sort of overall cohesive, coherent political package, that cohesive political package has to have some sort of domestic support. And in some economies, it's easier than others. I think, Jayati, what you're saying is that we need more books of Keynes essays in persuasion than we need books about essays in economics. There was no coherent political package in the post-war period. In fact, the coherent political package in the post-war period was to break down everything that had been done during the Depression in the United States. The same thing was more or less true in Britain, and it was more or less true in Holland, a country that had a very strong what we said, coherent, cohesive position, which was explained to me when I lived there, was on account of the dikes. That is, the Dutch were sensible enough to realize that if the dikes went down, they all would drown, and therefore they had to act together in order to build the dikes. So I think you're right, Jayati. It's not a question of having a coherent proposition. It's a question of, as in your representation of who has power. But if you look at the way this power system works, the power system of the people who are able to survive, those people who are certain that they're going to be able to go to the government and get the bailout. And the paradoxical thing here is that the people who are against the so-called cohesive or generalized umbrella are the people who are supposed to benefit from it. Okay, in the United States, the people who don't get the vaccine, the people who don't support the cohesive mechanism, are the people who would be the direct beneficiaries. So you're back to your persuasion again. Somehow or other, the people who have the power, they have the power not only because they can convince whether it's convincing the government or convincing themselves. But they also have the ability to convince everybody else that they deserve to have that support, and that everybody else should, well, just do your own individual thing, do the best you can to survive, and we're certainly not going to do anything in order to support you, and we're going to give you a way in which you can justify that to yourself. So now, liberties, our famous amendment rights, are the freedom to be a fascist if you want to. Okay, this is the way you have distorted that sort of power structure in the U.S. So yeah, I would say you can call it power, you can call it media influence on the system. But again, I'm back to this basic, as I say, Keynesian proposition, which says that the people who believe that they are going to survive because someone will take care of them have the power that other people do not have. The question which came up is that we do have cases in which people do contribute to provide food and sustenance to other people. But the problem is, this is a simple gift. Okay, gifts are what? Gifts are aleatory. They come and they go. You can't count on them. And if you look at the United States, we have now our food banks and our food kitchens that are running out of food, and we still have the people who are lining up in order to access the food which they do not have in order to survive. Now, whether this is the failure of the government in order to organize this, I would argue no, because if you went to those people who are contributing to the food banks, probably they're not going to vote for some sort of generalized provision of sustenance to people in conditions of pandemic. Now, just one last point which I would like to make is that, and I think, Jadi, you were right in saying, every nation is in a sense individual. China would not be China if it had not been for the, how can I say this nicely so I don't get into trouble, for Mao's misinterpretation of the possibility of running a collective economy and produce Deng Xiaoping in terms of a very clear alternative. Now, I would say very clear alternative in which we know it was not a clear alternative. We know that Deng Xiaoping had no idea what was going to come out of it. He knew what he didn't want, so you tried something else. In the US, after the Depression, you also knew what we didn't want, so we were willing to try something else. And more or less every country that's had this very sharp reversal, it comes not so much from a very well-detailed proposal or program for collective security. It comes out of the fact that, well, we know that didn't work, so we're going to have to try something else. And that something else eventually emerges into what we consider to be some sort of well-cohesive problem. We talk about the New Deal as some sort of alternative. The New Deal was no alternative. Roosevelt just, as I say, pulled this out of his hat during a campaign speech. And when he got to Washington, he had no clue what he was going to do. Eventually, he did what was right, responding to conditions, he knew what was wrong, but there was no very, very clear alternative. So again, I'm back to this business. The future is what? The future is survival. How do we survive? There are different ways of surviving. China did it in one way. The US and the New Deal did it in another way. India is also now doing it in a different way. And this is what then eventually will produce, I suppose, some sort of response tactic.
Okay, so let me ask Yochai to react as well, but let me first just throw one observation here, which is I think we are talking in terms of a triangle in which we have state capacity, political leadership, and political coalitions, right? Because those political coalitions are quite important. I would say that the US right now, political leadership is back. State capacities are being rebuilt very fast, but the political coalitions are really not that good, right? You have the Republican Party there, which is not very willing to cooperate, to say the least. But on the other end, and then Yochai, I think you probably will have very interesting things to say. We have culture, right? We have culture. And I just recall the book that, it's a kind of recent book, Rule Makers and Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World, which I think is kind of interesting in terms of how to frame the whole thing, because then I say that because let's call it the propaganda networks, your book, that might come in here to help us understand the role of culture when it is, let's say, coupled with the right or the wrong sort of political coalition in terms of how does this kind of political or political institutional package, how does this produce results, good or bad results in a crisis like the one we're facing? So thanks, please.
There's so much there. Let me just clarify to the extent that it wasn't clear in response, Jayati, to your criticism. There is no, I'm not going to try to persuade anyone that neoliberalism actually drove efficiency. It was definitely a program of power-seeking extraction by the professional and managerial class in the wealthier countries vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Particularly, we see it very crisply in the US at the expense of everybody below roughly the top 5%, possibly the top 1%. So that's, we're in complete agreement that it did not result in an efficient system. It was framed as efficiency seeking and growth seeking, but that was a smokescreen for an extraction program. Second, I completely agree with you that power is absolutely central. I suspect you don't only think of political power, but in the conversation, it felt as though there was an emphasis on political power. But I think I would be surprised if you disagreed that economic power and its structure were related, but not the same thing. And that a lot of what we're seeing is the deployment of institutions and technology and cultural habits of mind to legitimate economic power as well as political power. And in some sense, the most obvious, although not strongly empirically supported, is the massive platform of surveillance systems coupled with scientifically informed behavioral manipulation is the ultimate economic and cultural power grab by a small number of companies. I say that cautiously because the actual evidence of successful large-scale population-level manipulation of beliefs and preferences isn't there. But there's no doubt that the reason these companies are worth as much as they are is because the people who are buying their stock believe that they'll crack this nut and we'll be able to manipulate large-scale populations to hand over their money. Which brings us to the question of political propaganda, Leonardo, that you put on the table. And I just want to say one more thing on closing parentheses on your question on China, or what you described as Asia, and I think Jayati appropriately constrained to I think we'd like to see global trends, but there are really powerful national, cultural, historically specific pathways that different countries take that mean that the actual pattern of adaptation and impact to even the same set of broad ideas or broad economic changes are different in different countries based on their own political and cultural histories, based on the configuration of power within the country. And so we see a much more diversity than a single response that perhaps my initial presentation communicated. In the US, and I'll talk about what I know well, and I'll be curious to hear what others. In the US, what you have is a very intentional coalition beginning in the 1970s between the party of business, with a dramatic transformation of the political efficacy of organized business, coupled with white identity rejection of the civil rights movement, and fundamentalist Christian backlash against the women's movement and the new left reorientation of the moral universe towards the individual. And this bizarre alliance between people who would become the biggest losers of neoliberalism and the company and the party elites who would gain tremendously by stoking hatred gets played out beginning already with AM radio in the 1980s and cable. The whole internet, one of the things we found in all of the research we did on network propaganda is that the primary drivers are not actually various people and extremists on social media. It's coming straight from the top, and the political top and the media top, as a strategy to make money by giving a large minority population, white identity Christian voters, someone to hate and someone to validate their identity through stoking their hatred of others. And then harnessing those to elite goals of building economic power through harnessing the state to weaken labor and weaken consumers and weaken the state's ability to counterbalance the power. The thing that happened is they lost control over their party to Trump. And now they're scrambling to figure out how they play out, which is where you're seeing corporate donations, et cetera. So what we have is not persuasion based on, we have is propaganda and disinformation that continuously renders the US right more extreme because it's feeding its audience only what they want to hear. And what they want to hear is that they are right by hating someone else. And when I say that we don't have a coherent alternative, I'm not going to tell you that somebody sat down and the entire framework of high modernism emerged from someone's brain, from Keynes's brain, and then everything fell into order. But without denying that lots of people are trying various things in various subsections, I don't know that we have a coherent alternative in the way that neoliberalism had a story that at least elites could understand as a coherent story and then turn around and sell it justifiably or not. In the way that a shared sense of expertise and managerial ability and the ability to govern the world through well-organized systems was characterized high modernism. I'm not sure that we have that alternative. And yes, we're definitely seeing people trying to roll things out, and we'll have to try to systematize it. But I think one of the things that's going to be important to be able to communicate it, particularly to be able to communicate it beyond the people who are members of a coalition that's a specific coalition from today to tomorrow, is actually having a coherent narrative about how this set of things fits together to make a better life for all of us tomorrow. And without such a coherent narrative that we can communicate to large-scale populations, it remains susceptible to a simpler, more coherent story that will be harnessed by people who are trying to do the exact opposite of what we around this table are trying to do.
Before we get to some questions from the audience, let me just ask Jan if you care to react to this, to Yokai's ideas about neoliberalism having a coherent narrative as opposed to Keynesianism not having it. Would you agree basically with that? Or that it lost the sort of the narrative that initially seemed to work well, and then until it didn't?
Well, as you know, Leonardo, there never was a coherent Keynes narrative. We ended up with this very strange neoclassical synthesis after the war, which had nothing to do with the kinds of things that Keynes was interested in. But the other thing is that this neoliberal coherence, I mean, I think it's false on its face, because Josai has already said that this is this combination of these three incredibly diverse types of organizations, and how this can be coherent. It's difficult for me to understand how the evangelical Christians have a coherent approach that fits in with the business approach, which also fits in with the main lines of neoliberalism, which is Hayek on the one hand and Friedman and some of the Chicago people on the other. And there isn't even coherence in that particular grouping. What I would tend to argue is that there was a very sharp, coherent movement in terms of I can't say delegitimate or whatever it is, but the public choice attack on the efficiency of government. And this was a coherent movement. And it was very clear that this responded to, yes, the interests of business interests, the interests of certain other areas coordinate with the business interests, but it's something that goes back to the foundation of the country. This is Hamilton and Jefferson all over again. Do you need a strong central government or do you not? Jefferson says no, Hamilton says yes. Why? Hamilton says this is the way you preserve democracy. Because if you let the rabble decide, you end up with the Commune, you end up with the French Revolution, and you end up with Napoleon, and you end up with a dictator. On the other hand, Jefferson argued what? Exactly the same thing. He said, if you allow the Federalists and Hamilton to take over and you get this strong central government, and eventually you're going to end up with the king. So both of them feared exactly the same thing with these absolutely contrasting ideas about the role of government. And this is what moves through US history. You go to Jackson, you go to Roosevelt, you go to post-Roosevelt, you're always with this basic contradiction. Now, what happened in the 1970s is that Jefferson won. The Jeffersonian people won. They ended up discrediting the government. Ronald Reagan, the government is not the solution, government is the problem. And basically all of this counter coalition is based on that position. Now, the Democrats come back and say what? Well, the Democrats say government is the solution. They could not win because at the point that they were arguing this, it looked as if Reagan and these guys were in fact right. The government was not doing a great job. Okay? So in this particular context, I would say, yes, there was a very coherent idea, and that business interest was that we are going to get the government off our back, and you can do this by going to the farmer in the middle of Iowa saying, well, the government wants to block up this little stream because you're going to save some little tiny fishy. And the farmer looks at this and says, this is completely nuts. The government has to go. And we went from little fishies to all sorts of, how can I gently talk about social identity politics? Okay? So the other part of the thing is now the government tells me what bathroom I can go into. All right? So we still have this contradiction, and I would argue probably it's the public choice people who are still winning. And the public choice people are what? The public choice people are saying majority voting doesn't work. What works is being able to decide what I want to do. And if I have to fix the system in order to make that true, we're going to do that. And this is what is currently going on as you have this conflict between access to vote and the ability to constrict the access to voting in the US. So yeah, there was a coherent policy, but it was a much more general general proposition, which is, I would argue, endemic to the United States. As I said, this is the argument we've been having since since 1700 and whatever you want, wherever you want to start the resistance to British rule. And as I said, it produces something that doesn't bring about a clear solution. Okay, you can't have both Hamilton and Jefferson arguing that the thing that we fear is a despot. And the way we're going to do that is by diametrically opposed public policy.
Okay, thanks much. Let me just pick up a couple of questions from the audience here. I have a couple for Yochai. One is a very general question, which is what kind of general framework should be defined for a desirable tomorrow? General framework, I would maybe say what sort of institutional design coupled with some sort of political or sort of state capacity, because you empathized a lot that the need to restructure the state. So I would think that the question goes in that direction, the general framework in terms of state institutions and maybe something about culture. And the other one is more specific, kind of interesting, which is can we generalize Christianity as a promoter or of empathy? Wouldn't Pope Francis, for example, be one of many examples of the search for fraternal dialogue, which I think we could generalize in terms of, well, the search for new types of religions would be a way out of this mess in terms of, let's say, the love of money being the boss and everything else being sort of the servant, because this is an alternative that was put forward for a lot of several great thinkers. I would say Max Weber was one, Daniel Bell was one other. So this is an interesting general question, I would say. Would you care to react to them?
I'd love to hear, by the way, Jayati, if you have an answer to the general frame question, to either one of them. But let me say quickly about Christianity, in which I am not at all an expert. The words that I said were specifically about the political structure of the United States and a particular and particularly large movement within the US of Christian fundamentalism or evangelical Christianity. I think at a bare minimum, starting with Christian fundamentalism in the US, with Muslim fundamentalism in Iran, and both actually Shia and Sunni, with Hindu fundamentalism in India, I would be cautious empirically about the extent to which religion as a political force has been a moderating force in the last 100+ years. And I understand that the role of Catholicism, particularly in South America, has been quite distinct from any of those that I just raised. I think it very much depends on the particular, not even religion, but the brand of the religion or the kind of religion and how it's interpreted. And that there are, I suspect, in most religions, both universalistic, pluralistic model interpretations and atavistic, exclusionary versions. And I fear that in the teeth of the failures of and fears of modernity, religion has had its greatest political successes when it expressed itself in its more fundamentalist role as a basis of self-respect that does not involve participation in modernity, and in that regard has been a quite regressive force in most polities where it has come to play a very large role. On the question of the framework, if I had it, I'd be telling you. I think it would be useful for us to have it. I think I tried to outline the elements. I think we need to understand capitalism as fundamentally a conflict over productivity and power, that there's no separate model of market society that is purely focused on production as opposed to also on power and distribution, that what characterizes the historical moment of capitalism, the last 300 years or so, 250 years or so, is the driving imperative of the market and the universalizing of economic insecurity to force everybody into wage labor. And so I think a central aspect is removing the imperative of the market, limiting it at least substantially at the level of basic needs and capabilities, and an active role in restructuring power in the economy, an active role of both political and social self-organization to counter the market and contain it in order to create a more embedded or socially embedded economy, not purely in the state, but also in non-state, non-market bases. And that's the critical difference from the high modernist solutions that really do lean very heavily on the state. I don't think we have a name for it. I don't think we have an ideology for it yet. And I think that that's a major task, so that we become something that doesn't require 150,000 words to explain.
Thanks, Yochai. Jayari, I will invite you to jump in because, well, you were already asked by Yochai, and also because, as we know, India is a country that is so much embedded in religion. So you surely will have something interesting to say about that. But let me just preface that by saying that, well, we shouldn't underestimate the power and the importance of religion in terms of as a source of power, of course, because in a way, I don't know, again, as a provocation, what Jan just said in terms of the victory of the public choice and the neoliberal narrative could be maybe seen as the triumph of making market fundamentalism as a religion. So when you're able to convert this in sort of a religious way of looking at the world, then I think you won a big battle. So that's my take on that. But please, Jayadi, jump in.
Yeah, you know, this is always a very fascinating discussion. I remember contributing once to a journal issue on religion and economics, and I wrote, it was called Notes of an Atheist on the importance of religion in economics. But let me first, you know, yesterday I was on a panel organized by the Vatican Pass, you know, which is their, and I think the role that Pope Francis is playing, in fact, in commenting on the global economy and global politics, is incredibly important. Okay, I think that therefore, you know, definitely there are aspects of, you know, some part, the way that, you know, he's using the encyclicals and all of that to put forward a more progressive global agenda. I think that's very important, regardless of what one may think of his past or whatever. Having said that, it's impossible to generalize any religion as having common features. I mean, even Christianity, as Yochai has just been saying, has got all kinds of unpleasant strands and tendencies. Hinduism, I mean, the Hindutva that is being promoted by the current Indian leadership is obscene. It has no bearing on any strand of Hinduism as we have known it. It is a creation, and it's largely a political creation. And I would argue that it is a political creation that is being used as a means of hegemonic ideological dominance to create that kind of mass following and base that you can more or less swing to do whatever you like. But there are many different strands in many different religions, so I would say it's impossible to generalize. I mean, what I would argue is that it's important to promote something which is broadly more spiritual or ethical rather than religious. And it could stem from a religious perspective. It may not stem from, it could stem from a humanist perspective. It could be a counter to what you've just described, which is the religion of the supposed free market, which is really the religion of capital. You know, so it could be, but I think, yes, bringing back some notion of something beyond the love of money, basically, in a way, as what Jan was mentioning, is critical and is part of the overall requirement to capture the public imagination. Whether one can use religious symbols or not, yes, I think you can. I mean, Gandhi in India was very effective in using religious symbols, but in a more inclusive way that would also appeal to Muslims, Christians, etc., Buddhists. It's possible to do that. And it's also possibly necessary because of the fact that religion still plays such an important role in so many people's lives. I wouldn't give any particular religion a kind of, you know, award for being more inclusive or progressive. I would say that all of them have potential to be utilized in the advance of progressive or alternative causes. And it's really a question of how we can combine those with with a progressive stance or the broader framework that Yochai has been saying. Okay, Yochai, since you said about the framework and we don't have it, and Mao had this famous thing about how you cross the river by feeling the stones. And more or less, that's what Jan said has happened so far. All the big changes that we've seen in economic regime and so on, the Soviet Union, when it happened, it was also like that, right? In the beginning, they thought, yeah, Soviets are good enough. Soviets plus electricity, said Lenin. You know, all kinds of things happen in these. These are not a nice little blueprint template. It's not like making a machine. It is actually a much more complicated thing that evolves depending on changing political economy, changing power structures, recognition of different interest groups, the rights of different categories of people. So I think there isn't one very strict kind of blueprint. Having said that, I think we do have the elements of a framework, broadly framework, which has to be global, but also national, local. I mean, you know, the Green New Deal has been much talked about. I would say it has to be multicolored as a New Deal. Obviously, it has to be green in terms of addressing climate change and environmental damage, but it obviously has to be blue in addressing water. I don't know what it's like in Brazil, but I can assure you in most of Asia, water is a huge issue, and in many of the wars of the future are going to be about water. If we're still around to have wars, if the diseases haven't destroyed us by then. I think it has to be purple in terms of a much greater significance on the care economy. Like, you know, care has been defined in terms of, you know, purple. Obviously the pandemic has shown us it's not just about a better, you know, welfare and condition of life and so on, but it's about the very resilience of societies and economies. You can't actually have economies that survive if you ignore care to that terrible extent. And it has to be read for redistribution. So if you go back to that whole New Deal, what were the elements of that deal? It was recovery based on very large public spending. It was regulation of all kinds of markets, you know, labor markets, financial markets, other capital markets, and the nature and how much you can, you know, interfere with it, and product market regulation all over the place, and redistribution, which would also enable that, you know, I mean, so I think those are not, you know, they're not written in stone because they will vary with every country. But what it does mean is that then you have to have an international architecture that enables all of this. You have to have an international architecture that enables different kinds of financial regulation, depending on the requirements that are seen in that society and so on, that enables, you know, different kinds of environmental regulation. At the moment, we don't have any of that. We have punishing of attempts to have large public recovery, regulation, and redistribution, except for the favored few countries. So I don't think that we lack a framework. We kind of know what, you know, we need a framework for global trade that recognizes the need for employment generation. We need you know, all of those things they've been known since the Havana Charter, in a way. And we do know that, or as Jan says, we know what we don't want. And therefore, the alternative to that also, the elements of that are there, both nationally and globally. I would hesitate to put very clear, precise things on the national because it's so context specific. But I think the global requirements, we do know. Why are we not able to capture public imagination? I'm going back to this point. I know it sounds obvious, but I really think people don't know. I am stunned. Let me be honest. I'm stunned coming from India. I'm stunned at the extent to which my colleagues in UMass Amherst don't know very many basic things. Whether it's about intellectual property and the impact it's having, or the way in which, fiscal stances vary so dramatically across countries, or the nature of capital flows and the impact they're having. Even my progressive colleagues in a university in the northeast of the US do not know this. So obviously other people don't know. And so, yeah, maybe, lots more books of Keynes, but somewhere this message has to go out much more. I think if more people knew, I still have enough faith in humanity to think that we wouldn't have such a big mess. But maybe that's over optimistic, I don't know.
Okay, thanks much. So maybe let's try to end up with an idea that maybe what we need is sort of following Yochai in a different direction, is to build up a huge network propagandas that would try to diffuse this sort of messages. But this is not only about propaganda. This is about political economy. We all know that, politics and political economy. So I'm afraid.
Do I have time for one quick?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, just to pick up on your guys' point of the market. If we go back to the New Deal, which I have attempted to argue was not based on any sort of cohesive strategy, there was one cohesive element, and this came basically from Rexford Tugwell. And their argument was basically that the economy, the way the market system operated in the United States had changed from classical liberalism, in which you had individual producers and individual purchasers and individual reigned, to one in which monopolies reigned. And it was not only that monopolies reigned, but you had monopoly producers, but you also had trade unions. So that the government now had a role to supplant the market in providing some sort of equilibrium. And these were the arguments that took place when they were, for example, balancing the interests of agriculture against the interests of business firms against the business of the workers. And the argument would go something like this. Well, we have to put in increased agricultural prices because we know that this is the problem of the farmers. And then somebody would come up and say, well, but if we increase agricultural prices, then workers are going to have to spend more money and they're going to be worse off. So, oh, no, the argument is we're going to increase wages. And they said, okay, great, we're going to increase wages, but now the firms are not going to be able to make so much profit and they're going to stop investing. And this is the way the discussions went on within the brain trust. And the argument was that the government should be the fourth element that would exist in this triumvirate and would be able to bring about some sort of mediating impact in terms of some kinds of economic planning, in terms of some kinds of controls, and some kinds of other things. But they recognized very clearly that the market was no longer there. The market no longer functioned in a way that was politically acceptable. And you then get John Kenneth Galbraith, who explains this whole New Deal process in terms of countervailing power. He said, okay, countervailing power is something that we had in the Constitution, countervailing power between the executive, the legislature, and the judicial branches. We now have it in economics. We have the unions who have countervailing power over the firms who have countervailing power over the unions, and so forth. Now, the problem is that those very cohesive units, which provided some sort of, well, and eventually in the Austrian system, you had these cooperative bargaining systems to reach agreement. Those things all eventually collapsed. The unions collapsed, the interests of the monopoly capitalist producers collapsed, and eventually the interests of the government collapsed. Agriculture got paid off. Okay, the only one that came out of this very well is that agriculture got paid off in the sense that we took most of the people off of the land and we left the very large capital agricultural producers being funded directly by the government. So the government played its role in paying off agriculture, but the idea of having some sort of mediating arrangement between capital and labor basically disappeared. And many people would suggest that the only way we go back to the golden age is by trying to reconstitute those very large interest groups. The difficulty is that IT tells us that the entire system is probably going to go in the other direction.
Okay, so this has turned to a fascinating conversation and discussion as I sort of expected, but unfortunately we are approaching where I think we have to end the panel, right? It's time to do it. So I would say that, and from the reactions I'm getting here, I would say that we had an exceptionally brilliant panel in terms of how to open, a great opening for this month-long event. And I only have to thank you, to really thank you for accepting the invitation and for enlightening us and being so brilliant in terms of sort of opening up this very messy world that we have right now and throwing some very, very smart and interesting and useful departure points for us in the next month. So thank you again, and I hope you have the chance to follow some of the other meetings, the other panels. And let me ask Ana Célia if you want to say something just for the closing, or if we just have to close right away.
Yes, sure. It was a great session. Really, thank you so much. It was brilliant. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah,
Leonardo,
thank you so much. Thank you so much. And it was great to see you all.
Yeah, it was great to see
virtually,
you.
but still, it's good.
Lots to learn from. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Hi, Anna.
Hi. Hi. How are you? Missing all of you. Missing all of you. Gary, finally. I think we should stop recording, no, please. Otherwise, everyone will have access to our conversation. Oi, Marta. Hi, Marta. We need to stop recording, please. Support him, please.
Yeah, the cameras were turned off.
Oh, my friend. All of you.
Hello,
I'm
everybody.
so happy. Yeah.
Robert, good to see you.
Jean-Pierre.
Hi.
Can you stop?
Professora Ana Célia, yes, we stopped the streaming.
Yeah, please, because it's still recording. Tá continuando. Eu estou vendo aqui, recording.
Ok, record stopped.
Tá, mas quando